So today we're going to go over public health and vaccines. We're going to start with some stats, information, then we're going to talk about a little bit of the history, the safety, the monitoring of it, and just vaccine hesitancy in general. All right, so yeah, let's go ahead and jump in here. So first, global life expectancy across the globe between 1800s and the early 1900s was somewhere between 28.5 and 30 years old. This is very, very low, but it doesn't mean that most people were living until they were only 30. What it means is that the average life expectancy, so for every person who lived to 60, there was an infant who died in childhood. So that's going to average out to about 30. So it's not saying that that everyone died at that age. It's more just saying, hey, look, we had a lot of vulnerable deaths. So that's the elderly and the young people were dying at much higher rates. And so it was leading to this low global average life expectancy. So I looked it up. 2019, the global average life expectancy is 72. That is almost double what it was in the early 1900s. That is nuts. Okay, so that's mostly due to advancements in sanitation, antibiotics, and vaccines. So vaccines in particular decrease infant mortality because they are stopping the spread of infectious diseases. Okay, so before we had vaccines, let's just look at some statistics. Between 1783 and 1800, 50% of the children in Glasgow died of smallpox. This accounted for 40% of the deaths in the entire country. Oh, and they died of smallpox before the age of 10. It's nuts. And then in the rest of Europe and the rest of the other developing world, it was in the same time span, it was between 8 and 20% of all the deaths in those countries were due to smallpox. Now, pertussis, between 1922 and 1931 in the United States, there was 1.7 million cases. This is just whooping cough. Those 1.7 million cases led to 73,000 deaths. Now, compare those 1920s and 30s numbers to another 10-year span, 1983 to 1992. 74,000 cases were caused of pertussis, and that led to 57 deaths. So we went from 73,000 deaths to 50,000 deaths. That is nuts. Okay, now let's look at triple diphtheria, pertussis, and tinnitus vaccine. So this is the DPT vaccine. It was introduced, specifically, let's look at it in Japan. It was introduced in 1947. In that year, there was 100,000 cases of pertussis, and it led to 15,000 deaths. Now, they started the vaccine in 1947. By 1974, there was less than 300 cases and there were 0 deaths. So it went from 15,000 deaths to 0 deaths, like crazy. And then they switched it to just the DT, so the triple diphtheria and the tinnitus or tetanus shot. And they took out the pertussis from the vaccine. It took 5 years to go from 300 cases with 0 deaths, taking out the pertussis from the vaccine. 5 years later, 1979, 13,000 cases of pertussis led to 41 deaths. It's like 41 completely preventable deaths. And it was because they decided to switch it because there was a little vaccine hesitancy in Japan in the 70s, specifically with the medicine and pertussis, or that treated pertussis. Okay, polio, this is actually an ancient disease. Apparently they had outbreaks in antiquity. I didn't know about that, but there were really bad outbreaks in the United States from the 1900s until the vaccine was created and mandated and widely used in the 1950s. Okay, so in 1988, there were 300,000 cases of polio, 1,000 kids who were being paralyzed a day. And then by 1999, so this is 11 years later, there was less than 20,000 cases. So we went from 350 to less than 20,000. 350,000 to less than 20,000. Like, that's a huge drop off. And then by 2006, there was only 68 cases of polio. I think that's globally, which is nuts. So there's a podcast out there, Stuff You Should Know, and it's called, How We Almost Got Rid of Polio. Definitely check that one out. That one's going to have the more recent numbers, and it's going to talk about how this 680 number really hasn't gotten down to zero. I think that's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think their goal is to get the polio number to zero, completely eradicated. I think they were really, really close, but just some vaccine hesitancy has really prevented that. But yeah. Okay, so a little bit of history. So Edward Jenner is, in the West, considered the first person to use vaccines. He gave Philip James in May 14th, 1796, a little bit of pustules from someone's cowpox, and he put them in their nose, and that person, James Phillips, became immune to smallpox, or cowpox, which is where we get the name vaccine from. Vaccinilla virus. Vaccinilla is, I think, Latin for cow, or it's the cow virus is what it was. Cowpox was the problem. But that's really not actually how virology started. The study of viruses or vaccines, vaccinology. There was a lady 75 years before him, Lady Mary Wolter Montagu. Allegedly, she did the same technique 75 years earlier in 1721. Apparently, she learned it from Greek traders who came from Constantinople. But really, this practice had been seen in China, India, and Africa as far back as, I want to say, the 10th century. So, pretty myopic when we think about when we give Jenner all the credit. But he did make a major advancement, and ultimately his vaccine and his education about vaccines led to the eradication of smallpox in 1979. Oh man, that is so sad, because it was 100 years after he created it, and I don't think he saw it. Anyway, another major advancement in the field was Louis Pasteur, same guy who made pasteurized milk. He created the first vaccine in a lab. It was a vaccine against rabies. So vaccine safety monitoring system. So vaccines are the most effective public health tool that we have, especially for preventing any kind of infectious disease. Nonetheless, there can be adverse side effects. I'm sure everyone here has had a sore arm or something like that from a shot. In response to these adverse side effects, the CDC and the FDA jointly created a different system. So it's called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VARS. What a great acronym. It's so bad. But yeah, so between 1991 and 2001, almost 2 billion doses of vaccines were distributed, and VARS received 128,717 reports in that 10-year span. So we have 2 billion doses being given out, and we have about 130,000 reports of adverse effects. It is a huge amount of people who don't have adverse effects. You know what? That's pretty much 2 billion people who don't have adverse effects. I want to say that's, I don't know the math, but it's less than a percentage. I think less than 1%. I think it's less than 1% of 1% of people have reported adverse side effects to VARS. So yeah, crazy effective. But if this is a huge system, if they're going over 2 billion doses of vaccines over 10 years, are they really keeping track of all this data? How effective really is this? So between September of 98 and December of 99, so in about a 14-month span, VARS received 121 reports of effects after receiving this vaccine. It was the RRV-TV vaccine. I don't know what that one is, but the manufacturer saw the same issue, and they voluntarily decided to stop distributing this vaccine in July. So they were still receiving July of 99. So they first received notification in September of 98, and by July of the following year, the manufacturer had stopped distributing it, and I believe they stopped receiving any reports of adverse effects in 99. I don't really remember how bad these adverse effects were. But the point of this study was more to show you, look, as something as low as, it happens over the course of less than a year, and it happens with small numbers as 120 people reporting these issues, that they're going to take it seriously. So even though it's this huge operation, and even though there's 2 billion doses that are being distributed, a red flag as little as 120 people out of those 2 billion reporting it, that's going to set up a red flag, that's going to cause an investigation, and that literally stopped a manufacturer from producing a vaccine. That's all it takes. We are very good at monitoring these adverse side effects and catching them when they do happen. So next we're going to talk about vaccine hesitancy. This has been a very topical thing lately, but this really isn't a new issue. The vaccine hesitancy has always kind of been around. People are afraid of needles, but also people are just afraid of getting medicine. They're not totally trustworthy of the medical community. Some groups absolutely have justification for this. The way African Americans were treated by the medical community in the early 1930s was appalling. And if they don't trust medicine or doctors, I kind of understand it. But generally, there's been vaccine hesitancy, and it started to become, it gained a lot more ground in the early 2000s with this study by Dr. Andrew Wakefield. This was what measured or noticed a correlation between the rise in diagnosis of autism and the rise in vaccine distributions. Specifically, there was an MMR vaccine, so the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, that he correlated with the rise in autism. Now, the problem is, one, this is a correlative study. It's not a causation study, so it doesn't even do that. But on top of that, the scientific methods of the study are appalling. If anyone wants to look into it, definitely suggest it, but some of the negative highlights here are that only one of the 12 people in the study, children, I guess, infants, actually had autism. The other 11 didn't. They just maybe were on the spectrum or had signs of autism, but then later fully developed. So even though none of them had officially been diagnosed with developmental delays, they had all had notes of developmental delays. So they weren't officially, diagnosed that way, but they still were showing signs even before the study, even before the vaccine. On top of that, it wasn't a random sampling of people that was well populated. It was a highly selective, very small sample. As I said, only 12 participants were used in the study. And on top of that, it heavily relied on parents' memories or their beliefs or their recollections. It's like self-reported data is not good, let alone self-reported data that isn't even about yourself. It's maybe about your kids, so you're maybe even more likely to forget it. Okay, so those are just like some of the problems with the scientific method of all of that. On top of that, it was done for the purpose of litigation. And in 2010, I want to say there was 12 people originally who co-authored the article. Dr. Wakefield was the only one who did not recant it. The article was later retracted by the journal it was published in. So everyone's like, oh shit, bad study, maybe not. Nonetheless, it still spread. There was, famous people that became on Twitter. Vaccine hesitancy really spread because of the study. So, that led to a lot of unvaccinated people, and it also led to this distraction around autism. It's instead of focusing on the real causes or the real understanding of autism, we're, just pushing it onto this vaccines, and we're just saying, oh, it's all vaccines' fault. So the UK had a vaccination rate of greater than 90% in 1998, and it dropped to around 80% by 2003 to, I don't know if that's my handwriting, 2004 or 2009, I think 2004, was around 80%. Now this is going to be an issue when we get to herd immunity. If the vaccinated population or the immunized population drops below a certain threshold, a disease can come back. This is called an outbreak. So we might have thought it was eliminated, but if the threshold of herd immunity falls below that threshold, or the percentage of immunized people falls below that threshold, then there can be another outbreak of a disease that we thought was eliminated. It's like, oh my God, we got rid of this. What's happening? Okay, Ireland. This isn't just a US problem. Ireland, 99 to 2000, There were 3 children who died of measles in an outbreak. And then in the US in 2000, measles was thought to be eliminated until there was an outbreak in 2008. I want to say that was the one in San Diego. Just sad. Okay, so Dr. Wakefield's study tried to show that there was something in the vaccines that was causing the autism. He claimed that, and the study claimed that it was the thimerosal. This is a preservative that's been used in vaccines for a long time. It uses, it's one of its metabol, so it's ethyl mercury is what's in it. And it's just using that as a part of the vaccine, but it doesn't actually get metabolized. I don't think the mercury stays in your system and it's not actually harmful. But he was claiming that the ethyl mercury within it, within the vaccine, was what was harmful. Within the thimerosal, which was the preservative in the vaccine. Okay, so why do we even have preservatives in vaccines? Because there was a typhoid vaccine stored at room temperature in Columbia, South Carolina. There was 68 adverse effects, and it led to 4 deaths. So that was in 1916 of a typhoid vaccine. In 1929, there was a diphtheria vaccine that was contaminated, and 12 of 21 children died of staph infections in Australia. That was in 1928. So between those two and probably other instances where vaccines became contaminated, just those were the more extreme examples. In 1968, it became a requirement in U.S. Code of Federal Regulations that vaccines needed some sort of preservative. So thimerosal was one of the preservatives that was used. So between 1968, when it became required, to 1999, it was often used. In 99, Public Health Services, the U.S. Public Health Services recommended removing thimerosal from any vaccines, using other preservatives instead. By 2001, so just 2 years later, at most there were only trace amounts of thimerosal left. Inspired by the thimerosal-free vaccines, or in spite of these thimerosal-free vaccines, rates of developmental disorders continued to increase. Again, this wasn't in the US. In places where they had thimerosal-free vaccines, they still saw a rise in autism. So it happened, there was a study between 87 and 98 in Montreal. They had some with thimerosal-free vaccines and some with, and they still showed high rates of autism. Actually, in the Montreal study, the thimerosal-free vaccine was actually correlated with more problems than the thimerosal one. So it's like, look, thimerosal really wasn't the problem there. Between 89 and 2003, the California Department of Developmental Services saw an increase in autism, while at the same time seeing a decrease in thimerosal use. In Denmark, there was a nice natural experiment where they, some people naturally got the thimerosal one, and some people were randomly chosen not to get the thimerosal one, and it actually showed, look, thimerosal is not a problem. So the study found, there was another study that maybe found mercury had a higher correlation to causing autism. And then another study in 2011 found statistically significant positive correlation between vaccine rates and autism. Okay, so a statistically positive correlation, ask any statistician, that is just a correlation. These two things are rising at the same time. It's not anything, it might not be anything other than that. You have to keep looking into it. So right now, these studies are just showing, look, maybe there's a correlation. And we took out the thimerosal, which is what Wakefield was against. What he claimed caused the autism, it's showing, look, that's clearly not causing the autism. So at most, these studies are saying, okay, maybe there's something else in the vaccine that might be causing autism. But that still just seems unlikely. I mean, the rates of autism rising could be explained by a lot of different things. So, one, we just have a better understanding of autism in general. Two, the DSM has been changing. How we actually diagnose autism has been changing. So of course those numbers are going to be increasing. All these things, there's a lot of ways of explaining autism rising that doesn't have to do anything with vaccines. Okay, so one last thing. So to really like think about the Wakefield study, the reason he hasn't, Dr. Andrew Wakefield hasn't recanted his position on the study and position on the link between autism and vaccines is because he also had his own vaccine. He had a vested interest in his own vaccine that actually didn't have thimerosal. So not only like did he do a bad study, did he sell it bad, the rest of his colleagues took it back. His theory ended up being wrong that thimerosal was the cause of it anyway. If anything, maybe it's something else in the vaccine, but it's definitely not the thimerosal. And then on top of that, he had a vested interest in vaccines that didn't have thimerosal. So it's like, oh my, it's just so frustrating when you like get into the details of the study that has caused countless deaths that could have been prevented. And it's usually innocent children who are dying from these diseases. So this study is extremely frustrating. And then on top of that, vaccine hesitancy has been linked to not just the US and not just this Andrew Wakefield study, but religious leaders in Pakistan, Nigeria, and Afghanistan between 2003 and 2004 were very anti-vaxxing. I think this was part of the problem. I think Afghanistan in particular is where the last bit of polio is. So vaccines immunize the individuals, but vaccines can also have a benefit beyond the individual. This is known as what's called herd immunity. So the idea behind herd immunity is that if enough people, a certain threshold of people in a certain population, are immunized against a pathogen, then that population is immunized against the pathogen, even if not everyone in that population is immunized. So the pathogen or the disease has been eliminated from a region because a certain threshold of people in that region were immunized. So this has been going around lately, and a lot of people probably think that this is some sort of like natural law. But this is actually something that epidemiologists have only recently discovered. And so it's something that we're inferring from seeing the populations and seeing, oh, only 80 or 70 or 60% of the population was vaccinated, and yet we still notice that the disease went away. So how do we calculate what that threshold is? There's actually a way of thinking about this. So to calculate herd immunity, you need to use the reproduction rate of the disease and the size of the population. So what this means is that, so the reproduction rate is sometimes called R naught. And so when the R naught is the number of people so the R naught is the number of people who are expected to contract the disease after coming into contact with an infected person, like in the right circumstances. So, we all know about coronavirus. If you're outside, that's not going to be a good circumstance for you to get it. But if you're, maskless within 6 feet of them for more than, I want to say 15 minutes, or maybe it's 6 minutes. But there are certain conditions where once you've met those conditions, then you've been exposed and you're likely to develop this disease, or unless you've been naturally immunized against it. So the higher R naught you have, the more and quickly the disease spreads. So like for instance, mumps has a very high R naught. I want to say it's close to 60. It's very, very fast. And in contrast, I want to say the coronavirus is 2.8 or something like that, and that was before Omicron, so it might have gone up since then. As opposed to things like the flu, I want to say it's closer to 1. So it barely stays alive. Okay, so another way of like thinking about herd immunity is this bowling alley analogy. So imagine like everyone is in their own lane, they're in their own little bubbles, they're doing their own thing, but the person in lane 1 gets sick. That sickness can travel to lane 2, to lane 3, lane 4, lane 5, lane 6, and so on. So what could we do? Like we'd eventually get natural immunity, but if we had herd immunity, then what it is someone might be protecting someone else. So if the bowler in lane 1 has a disease, but the bowler in lane 2 is vaccinated against that disease, it doesn't matter what lane 3 or so on have, the disease is going to stop right there at lane 2. It's not going to go on to lane 3, it's not going to go on to lane 4. That's what herd immunity is. You're protecting other people further on down the line. Okay, so the way herd immunity isn't a new thing with just vaccines. There's like two ways that we can get herd immunity. You can either get herd immunity by developing a natural immunity to the pathogen or by getting vaccinated. So before we had vaccines, especially mass distribution of vaccines, we had herd immunity the hard way, kind of. So the way this works is, if you're exposed to a disease, you can either become infected or maybe you could become a carrier. And if you are a carrier, then you spread it to other people, but you might not have symptoms yourself. These are more like the asymptomatic carriers of the coronavirus. But if you are infected, then there's two alternatives. Either your body develops an immune reaction to it. You might get sick for a few days, but eventually your body will fight off the illness. The other alternative is that you die. So the people who don't die after becoming infected, those people are going to develop a natural immunity to that disease. So the next time their body sees that disease, it's going to say, oh, I know this one. I know how to take care of it. So the body's going to be protected that way. It's going to develop that natural immunity. So eventually there's going to be enough people in the society that the society is going to be protected and that disease is going to be eliminated from that society. But along the way, there's going to be a whole bunch of people who are going to die, and it's sad and tragic. Okay, so that was pretty much the only way we could develop herd immunity and eradicate diseases before we had mass vaccines in the 1940s. Now, since we have that, since those have been developed, we can get herd immunity through vaccinations. And so we can get to that higher number of 80, 90% much quicker and without the death and loss of life that we otherwise would have seen through this natural immunity. Yes, we can do that without people getting sick. And yeah, so the whole point is that the whole point of herd immunity is to get to a certain threshold, to get to a certain amount. Once we've gotten to that certain amount, then there are certain people who, don't need to be vaccinated in order for the whole herd to have that immunity. Now, if there's only going to be certain people who, don't need it, we want that number to be as little as possible. So we're going to use that number. We want that number. The idea is that you want that number to just be people who absolutely cannot get the vaccine. So these are people who are immunocompromised. So someone who's going through cancer treatment right now, in order for them to get the cancer treatment, I think chemo or radiation, I think it's radiation, it completely destroys your immune system. So if they were to get injected with the tiniest amount of an attenuated or an inactive vaccine or an inactive virus, their body might go crazy. It doesn't know how to develop that immune system response to it. So those are the people who are unable to get vaccinated are the people that we're trying to protect with this herd immunity. Okay, so a couple more stats. Just preventable diseases. So certain vaccines exemptions have been linked to outbreaks of preventable diseases. We had 10 deaths of pertussis in California in 2010. Again, that's just whooping cough. Like 10 people died from a cough. That's nuts. There was 486 out of 892 members of a church community in Philadelphia who died, or maybe just contracted. I'm not sure how many died, but contracted measles in 1991. So there was a study of the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated, how much more risk they were taking on. This was done in Colorado between 1987 and 1998. So this was actually me. I was in this study. I grew up in Colorado. I was born in '89. I was vaccinated sometime between 89 and 98. So I'm in the middle of this study. It turns out I was 22% less likely to get measles than the unvaccinated person in Colorado. And I was 6 times less likely to get whooping cough. I don't think I ever got either one of those growing up, and I am glad I was vaccinated. But that's just the general population. Now imagine if it was in daycare where children are more vulnerable to this stuff. And it's just closer quarters. So in daycare in Colorado, if you were unvaccinated, you were 62 times more likely to get measles. And you were 16 times more likely to get pertussis. That's nuts. I'm very glad that I was vaccinated in Colorado and did not have to deal with those just exponential risks. And so yeah, just beyond the benefits to the individual who does receive the vaccine, the benefits of herd immunity are going to be conferred upon the entire society as a whole. So Bagnandi is going to argue that there's 3 generations of vaccines so far. So the first generation was, what was created by Jenner and Pasteur in the lab. These were going to use inoculated or live attenuated pathogens, something like the smallpox or the tuberculosis vaccine. The second generation is going to be the subunit vaccines. These use purified or recombinant microbial components. These vaccines were greatly developed and aided by the more information we knew about DNA. So the third generation is the generation that we're currently in. This is in the book it's called Omics, the Omics generation, OMICS. This is going to include immunology, genomics, proteomics, not quite sure what that is, and bioinformatics. But this has also, been helped along by advances in the Human Genome Project. The more and more we know about DNA and sequencing and all of that has helped create these most recent vaccines. So this is going to be the mRNA vaccines that we are talking about today. That's the BioNTech or and the Moderna one, the Pfizer and the Moderna. Yeah, I think the second generation of vaccines was what the J&J was. So that's going to use that's what they mean when they're saying it's different technology. It's literally just we've made such advancements in the fields of vaccines since then that we can create these much more powerful, much more direct, advanced vaccines. So, though there are shortcomings to this third generation of vaccines, so they tend to only be based on like one strand or one variant. This is something that's coming up a lot right now with the coronavirus and all the different variants that are coming out. So this is also a problem with other viruses, like HIV is a virus, the human immuno-something virus. HIV, tends to have genetic variations so much that we can't create vaccines against it. Or if we tried to create a vaccine against it, it would mutate and it would be ineffective, very quickly. On the other end of the spectrum, we have polio. So polio doesn't have a lot of genetic variations. It doesn't have a lot of genetic drift. And so our one polio vaccine that was developed in the 30s to the 50s, somewhere in there, that vaccine is still effective today. But so these more advanced ones, the more targeted the vaccine gets, the more ineffective over time it might be. So these are newer, wonderful, awesome technologies, but they might have these other shortcomings or limitations that other vaccines might not have.